For decades, Hollywood has been selling us the same image of the ideal Scandinavian. He's a huge, bearded man who's been clutching a bloodied axe since birth. He wakes up, raids the neighboring village, drinks ale from an enemy's skull, and goes back to sleep. Sounds like a great script for a blockbuster action movie, doesn't it? But the historical reality was so different that modern screenwriters would simply refuse to believe it. We're used to thinking of Vikings as a ruthless killing machine that terrorized all of Europe. But here's where it gets interesting. The word Viking wasn't even a noun in their language. It was a verb, meaning a temporary trip somewhere beyond their home fjord. Most of these rugged northerners considered themselves anything but professional warriors. They were farmers, carpenters, and merchants whose main battle was against the harsh Scandinavian wilderness. It's time to forget the fairy tales about horned helmets and take a look at the real life of the 8th century. 8th century Scandinavia was an utterly unforgiving place to live. Winter here lasted an eternity, and the ground consisted mostly of rocks and frozen clay. Growing even a handful of wheat under such conditions was a true feat. Summer flew by unnoticed, leaving farmers only a tiny window for sowing and harvesting. Modern farmers use smart tractors, chemical fertilizers, and satellite navigation for this. The ancient Scandinavians had to rely solely on calloused hands and primitive iron plows. It was agriculture, not war, that determined a person's status in society. If you owned a large plot of fertile land, you were automatically considered part of the local elite. The respect of neighbors was earned through the ability to feed one's large family and dependent workers. A true Scandinavian chieftain took pride not in the number of enemies he had slain, but in the size of his granary. Sounds incredibly boring for a rugged northern epic, doesn't it? But without full granaries, even the fiercest berserker would simply have starved to death by mid-December. The social hierarchy was built around ownership of plots near water and in sheltered valleys. The closer a house was to a fjord, the more fertile and valuable the soil was considered. The poor were left with the hillsides, where the wind mercilessly blew away the precious topsoil. That is why good fields were passed down from generation to generation and guarded like the apple of one's eye. To lose one's ancestral plot meant condemning one's entire family to a miserable existence. A strong-willed farmer always held onto his farmland until his last breath. Working the land demanded monstrous physical endurance every single day. Peasants rose before dawn and cleared the fields of heavy glacial boulders by hand. It was grueling training that modern athletes would call extreme CrossFit. In the evening, people would collapse from exhaustion, only to take up the hard labor again in the morning. But instead of a gold medal at the finish line, these people were given a chance to survive the winter. That's why, by the start of mating season, every farmer had the muscles of an Olympic weightlifter. Livestock farming played an even more important role than growing finicky grain crops. Cows, sheep, and pigs literally saved entire settlements from certain starvation. They provided not only meat, but also precious milk, warm wool, and durable leather. In the Icelandic sagas, one can find dozens of pages detailing legal disputes over a single sheep. It is difficult for modern people to understand why rugged warriors would discuss the theft of livestock with such passion. For them, every cow represented a walking bank account and a guarantee of the family's survival. In winter, livestock often had to be kept right inside the house to stay warm. People and animals slept under the same roof, keeping each other warm during the bitter January frosts. Storing hay for the long winter months became a matter of life and death for the entire household. If there wasn't enough feed, cows had to be slaughtered prematurely, depriving the family of their source of milk. This difficult decision was always made after lengthy family discussions. Carefully calculating winter supplies, required exceptional intelligence from the head of the household. But here lies the main problem with this agricultural paradise. Scandinavian families were large, and there was a catastrophic shortage of arable land. Each new generation received an ever smaller piece of fertile soil from their fathers. At some point, there simply wasn't enough food to go around for all the inhabitants of the growing settlements. What was a young man to do when all he inherited were rocks and a couple of old hoes? He had to seek alternative ways to earn a living beyond the confines of his own yard. The departure of younger sons from their family homes became a harsh and inevitable tradition. They banded together in small groups to seek a better life in foreign lands. Some hired themselves out as guards to wealthy jarls, while others ventured into the dense forests to hunt fur-bearing animals. Marten and Arctic fox pelts were highly prized and served as excellent trade goods. This was the first step toward the formation of those very famous bands of adventurers. Without land of their own, these young men were ready for the most desperate and risky endeavors. It was precisely the lack of arable land that forced the Scandinavians to turn their gaze toward the boundless sea for the first time. Water was always nearby, offering rich fish stocks to supplement their meager diet. Herring and cod fishing became a veritable industry, providing protein for hundreds of thousands of people. Men spent many hours in the icy water, risking their lives for a good catch. Severe storms regularly claimed the lives of these brave souls, but hunger drove new boats out to sea. It was a harsh school of survival that quietly prepared them for future long-distance expeditions. Gradually, the boats grew larger, and fishing routes ventured farther and farther from their native shores. Sailors learned to navigate by the stars, the direction of the wind, and the flight of seabirds. They memorized the outlines of distant islands and observed the migration routes of vast schools of fish. Seafaring skills were passed down from elders to the younger generation right on the deck of a freezing ship. This is how a unique shipbuilding art emerged, unmatched anywhere in Europe. Step by step, the fishermen became unrivaled masters of navigation. Modern science has proven that the diet of the ancient Scandinavians was surprisingly balanced. They consumed vast quantities of fatty fish, which provided the energy needed for grueling physical labor. Skyr, fermented meat, and dried seaweed served as their modern-day multivitamins. In the summer, women gathered wild berries and medicinal herbs in the forests to boost their immunity. In fact, their diet resembled the menu of professional bodybuilders on a strict protein diet. It's no wonder that Europeans were terrified at the sight of these massive, radiantly healthy people. However, even a perfect diet could not save them from sudden climatic disasters. A single cold, rainy season could completely destroy the already meager northern harvest. When the grain rotted right on the stalk, the settlement had only one brutal option left. They had to board ships and sail south in search of the missing resources. They set out on raids not out of bloodlust, but out of desperation and sheer hunger. It was an economy of survival where the sword was used only as a last resort. Trade often went hand in hand with plunder on these desperate voyages. The Scandinavians willingly exchanged their furs and walrus ivory for silver or scarce grain. But if they saw weak defenses and full granaries, the temptation to take everything by force often got the better of them. The morality of the time was simple and harsh toward any outsiders. The main goal always remained saving one's own family from starvation at any cost. Returning home with holds full of provisions was celebrated as a true holiday. Try to imagine yourself in the shoes of such a typical 8th century Scandinavian farmer. For months, you tend to your crops, repair the roof, and stockpile firewood for the winter. Suddenly, a frost sets in, and you realize your children won't survive until spring. Your heart aches with fear for your loved ones, and you make the only possible decision. You grab your work axe and head to your neighbors across the sea. Nothing personal, just the harsh medieval business of securing food. The so-called Vikings always remained farmers at the core of their rugged Scandinavian souls. Even when conquering new lands in England or France, their first act was to begin plowing them. Their main dream was not Valhalla with its endless battles, but a good piece of fertile land. They wanted to sow wheat, not sow panic among the peaceful European population. Conquered territories were quickly built up with their familiar longhouses and spacious livestock pens. It's just that the world remembered them for those rare days when they took up arms.
Leave that timber up. We need more rope.
If you ask any passerby about Viking weapons, they'll immediately mention the massive double-edged axe. Hollywood directors love this prop because it looks as intimidating as possible on screen. The huge blades gleam menacingly in the sun and split fictional enemies in two with a single blow. But this is one of the biggest historical misconceptions of our time. Double-edged axes were completely useless in real close combat due to their enormous weight. A real Scandinavian would simply have tapped his temple at the sight of such an impractical weapon. In reality, the axe was first and foremost a versatile tool for construction and agriculture. Metal was incredibly expensive in Scandinavia, so no one could afford highly specialized items. The peasant's axe was used for chopping wood, slaughtering livestock, and building sturdy wooden houses. It was a true medieval multi-tool, passed down from father to son for generations. When the time came to defend their land, a farmer would simply grab his work tool. Why buy an expensive sword when your firewood axe pierces wooden shields perfectly? The combat technique for wielding an ordinary work axe was perfected to the utmost. Warriors learned to deliver quick and precise strikes without wasting unnecessary energy on a wide swing. The small axe head made it easy to hook the edge of an enemy's shield and pull it sharply downward. This instantly left the enemy open to a fatal blow from a spear or knife wielded by a comrade in the ranks. Thanks to its short handle, the weapon was ideally suited for close-quarters combat on the deck of a cramped ship. In skilled hands, this working tool became a truly deadly weapon. Blacksmithing in Scandinavia was considered practically a sacred art, shrouded in a multitude of mystical rituals. Blacksmiths used bog iron ore, which had to be gathered under the unbearable conditions of mosquito-infested swamps. Modern engineers marvel at how these craftsmen achieved the necessary temperature without industrial equipment. They added animal bones to the furnaces to saturate the metal with vital carbon. Ancient people sincerely believed that the spirit of a ferocious beast passed into the forged blade. Without realizing it, ancient craftsmen had in fact invented a primitive form of high-carbon steel. Working at a red-hot forge required immense patience and tremendous physical strength. The master would spend hours forging a stubborn piece of metal, shaping it with precise hammer blows. A skilled blacksmith was always held in high esteem and considered one of the wealthiest people in the settlement. People came to him not only for weapons, but also for ordinary nails, cauldrons, or door hinges. His smithy often served as a gathering place for local news and discussions of important village matters. Losing such a talented master was a terrible blow to the entire local community. Crafting a single high-quality sword took several months of grueling labor. The weapon cost as much as an entire herd of excellent dairy cows. A sword was always a symbol of the highest status and an indicator of its owner's incredible wealth. Therefore, only the wealthiest jarls and very fortunate merchants could afford swords. An ordinary guy from a Norwegian village had never held anything like that in his hands in his entire life. This reflected the harsh practicality of people who counted every iron coin. Many magnificent swords found in Scandinavian burial sites were originally brought from other countries. Frankish blades were renowned for their incredible quality and often became coveted spoils in daring raids. Warriors cherished such precious weapons more than their own eyes and gave them loud, fearsome names. The beautiful hilt was often artfully decorated with silver or gold, emphasizing the owner's nobility. However, in the heat of a brutal battle, such elegant beauty played absolutely no role. In such desperate moments, only the ability to quickly draw a simple spare knife could save the day. Incidentally, the spear was the true king of the medieval battlefield, not the beautiful sword. It required a minimum of precious metal, but ensured maximum distance from the enemy's blade. The Scandinavians trained to throw spears and stab their opponents with them from early childhood. It was a cheap, brutal, and incredibly effective weapon of mass destruction. A formation of warriors with long shafts thrust forward instantly turned into an impenetrable wall of spears. 2 centuries earlier, the Roman legions had come to exactly the same logical conclusion. Spears served a wide variety of purposes and differed greatly in the shape of their forged tips. Some were designed specifically for a powerful throw and had a narrow, armor-piercing blade. Others featured a broad tip and were intended to inflict terrible slashing wounds in close combat. The shaft was most often made of resilient ash wood, which did not break under severe bending. In Norse mythology, the supreme god Odin himself was always depicted with a spear in his hand. This further underscores the colossal importance of this simple weapon to the peoples of the North. But the most ingenious invention of Scandinavian military thought was their famous round wooden shield. It was made of lightweight planks covered with leather and weighed surprisingly little. In the center was an iron umbo which protected the arm and served as a knuckle duster in close combat. The shields were deliberately made thin at the edges so that enemy weapons would get stuck in the pliable wood. A skilled warrior could easily wrench a sword right out of an attacker's hands with a sharp twist of the shield. It was a brilliant engineering trap, disarming the enemy in a matter of seconds. Modern reenactors long struggled to understand why Scandinavian shields were so fragile. They tried making them from thick oak, resulting in heavy and completely unwieldy structures. It turned out that ancient craftsmen intentionally created disposable shields from the soft wood of linden or pine. In battle, the shield was meant to absorb the blow and break, saving its owner's life. This is reminiscent of modern cars, which are designed to crumple on impact to save passengers. Ancient people had a deep understanding of the laws of physics without any university degrees. On long sea voyages, they always took an impressive supply of spare planks for repairing their shields. After every fierce skirmish, warriors would sit by the campfires and hastily repair their battered shields. During voyages, brightly painted round shields were mounted along the sides of ships, protecting the rowers from the icy wind. The shield's paint scheme often served as a distinguishing mark, helping to tell friend from foe in the bloody chaos. The color red was particularly popular, as it symbolized fearlessness and readiness for a decisive battle. The ability to wield a shield skillfully in formation was valued even higher than personal bravery. And what about those famous horned helmets that appear in every movie? That's pure fantasy from 19th century opera costume designers. Horns on a helmet are the worst idea in the history of military equipment. Any sword strike that might simply glide off a smooth helmet would catch on the horn and snap your neck. Head protection must be as streamlined as possible to easily deflect the enemy's direct attacks. The Scandinavians were tough guys, but they certainly weren't fools. A typical Viking-era warrior looked more like a ragged farmer than a shining knight. Most had no metal armor at all, relying instead on layers of thick woolen clothing. The wool repelled icy water perfectly and did a decent job of softening the glancing blows of enemy blades. Chainmail was considered an unimaginable luxury, fit only for kings or elite mercenaries. Imagine a modern war where only the general has a bulletproof vest, while the rest fight in sweaters. That is roughly how the legendary Scandinavian raids appeared in the eyes of historical science. Weapons in their society did not serve as instruments of aggression or professional domination. They were a guarantee of personal freedom and the right to speak at the people's assembly. A man without an axe or a spear was effectively considered a slave, deprived of all legal rights. Possessing a blade meant you could protect your family and defend your interests against your neighbors. That is why even the most peaceful farmer always kept a sharp blade close at hand. It was an era where the line between farming tools and weapons of murder was non-existent. When we talk about Viking-era technology, everyone immediately thinks of ships and weapons. However, Scandinavia's true superpower was an industry rarely mentioned in adventure books. I'm talking about the production of high-quality woolen fabrics for sails and warm clothing. Without this tedious domestic labor, no maritime conquests would have been physically possible. Women stood at looms for days on end, laying the foundation for future European expansion. Creating a single large square sail for a drakkar required an incredible number of man-hours. Historians have calculated that the fabric for a single ship took about 4 years of continuous work. This is an absolutely insane expenditure of time and resources for a medieval subsistence economy. By comparison, it took carpenters only a few months to build the wooden ship itself. It turns out that the sail cost more and took longer to make than the rest of the naval fleet. It sounds strange, but it was the weavers who controlled the pace of the Scandinavian threat's spread. The entire process began with the proper breeding of sheep in the harsh conditions of the northern climate. Scandinavian sheep possessed a unique double-layered fleece that protected them from the icy, biting winds. The outer layer was long and water-repellent, while the inner layer was soft and incredibly warm. Women harvested this wool by hand, taking care not to harm their precious livestock. Then began the lubbying process of cleaning and preparing the material for spinning. The Scandinavian vertical loom looked like a strange web of stones and threads. Working at it required constant physical exertion, as the weaver had to stand for hours on end. The threads were tensioned using special clay weights, which archaeologists find by the dozen in every excavated house. It was hard industrial labor that fell exclusively on the frail shoulders of women. Modern factories produce meters of fabric in seconds, requiring no human effort. Ancient craftswomen spent weeks of their lives for a single small piece of waterproof cloth. Woolen clothing was literally a matter of survival on the open cold sea during a storm. Ordinary linen would get soaked instantly and quickly lead sailors to fatal hypothermia. Wool retained heat even when completely wet, saving crews from death. In fact, women created high-tech gear for their men, similar to modern thermal underwear. Without these warm tunics, no Viking would have even made it to England. But the fabric was not merely a utilitarian material for sails and warm clothing. In the Viking Age, a woolen cloth called wadmal served as official hard currency. It was used to pay taxes, purchase land, and even settle blood money for murder. Merchants measured their immense wealth not by chests of gold, but by rolls of high-quality wool. It was a stable economic system based on real, women's manual labor. This is precisely why women in Scandinavian society were held in such high esteem and enjoyed extensive rights. While their husbands unsuccessfully attempted to raid British monasteries, their wives managed entire agricultural corporations. They held the keys to all the warehouses, conducted trade, and managed the family budget. If a husband proved to be a failure, the woman had the full legal right to file for divorce. To the rest of patriarchal Europe, such freedom seemed unthinkable and frightening. By the standards of the early Middle Ages, Scandinavia was a true paradise of triumphant feminism. Many historians argue that a shortage of women may have been one of the reasons for the long-distance expeditions. Wealthy jarls practiced polygamy, taking for themselves the most beautiful and healthy young women. Poor young farmers simply had no brides left with whom to start a proper family. To find a wife and prove his worth, a young man needed silver and status. This drove them onto ships and forced them to risk their lives in desperate overseas ventures. It is interesting to note how women defended their rights in this harsh society of armed farmers. The sagas often describe instances where wives publicly mocked their husband's cowardice or foolishness. Such humiliation could completely destroy a man's social standing in a small, rural community. Women could also initiate blood feuds, compelling relatives to take up arms. They were the hidden puppet masters of this brutal era, pulling the strings of male vanity. No important journey was planned without the approval of the wise mistress of the great house. So, when you look at a majestic Scandinavian drakkar, remember one important thing. This ship was propelled not only by the wind and the rower's muscles. It was driven forward by years of grueling labor by the women left behind on distant rocky shores. Their invisible contribution to history turned out to be far greater than all the swings of iron swords. The Viking Age was woven from sheep's wool, not forged from blood-stained steel. Scandinavian shipbuilding was so advanced that scientists are still amazed by their technologies. Drakkars are often called the pinnacle of engineering thought in the early European Middle Ages. But here it is important to understand one fundamental fact that shatters stereotypes. Most ships were built not for brutal warfare, but for the mundane transport of heavy cargo. They were the ancient long-haul trucks of their day, not futuristic military destroyers. Scandinavian craftsmen never used blueprints or complex mathematical formulas. All the proportions of the ideal vessel were stored exclusively in the mind of the experienced master builder. They literally felt the wood with their hands, selecting trunks with natural curves for the frames. If a tree grew crooked, a modern lumberjack would have discarded it as scrap. A Scandinavian carpenter rejoiced because that very curvature produced the perfect planking piece. This resembles the work of a modern sculptor who sees the finished piece within a block of marble. The clinker planking method became the main secret behind the phenomenal strength of these long ships. The planks were laid, overlapping one another, and fastened with sturdy iron or wooden rivets. This design made the ship's hull incredibly flexible, like the spine of a giant sea serpent. During a storm, the ship did not resist the waves, but glided and bent with them. Rigid European ships cracked under the force of the elements, while the drakkars simply danced on the water. It's amazing, but the Vikings hardly ever used saws to cut thick logs. A saw tears the natural grain of the wood, making the plank weak and prone to rotting. Instead, they split the logs with axes and wedges strictly along the grain. This took 10 times longer, but the result was virtually indestructible. Modern carpenters call this a mad waste of effort and time, but it was precisely thanks to this obsessive perfectionism that their ships crossed the Atlantic and reached America. The draft of a typical Scandinavian ship was only about 1 meter. That sounds like the description of a small riverboat, not a formidable ocean vessel. However, it was precisely this incredible lightness that gave them an absolute tactical advantage. They could sail on the open sea and then easily enter the shallow European rivers. To the inhabitants of the continent, it looked as if enemy ships were sailing right across wet grass. Merchant ships, called Norse, differed from the sleek drakkars in their clumsy width. They were thick, slow, and lacked the fearsome appearance that people love in movies. But it was precisely these floating trucks that built the Vikings' true economic empire. Their holds carried tons of walrus ivory, furs, amber, and livestock. They were the true workhorses of the northern seas, ensuring the survival of entire colonies. Viking navigation remains a subject of heated scientific debate and speculation to this day. They had no magnetic compasses, complex astrolabes, or detailed paper maps. They navigated by the sun, the color of the water, the behavior of birds, and the scent of distant lands. Icelandic sagas mention a mysterious sunstone that allowed them to locate the sun even in cloudy weather. Scientists have proven that Icelandic spar crystals do indeed polarize light and function as an ancient navigational tool. These farmers had figured out the optical laws of physics long before they were officially discovered. Each ship was not merely a means of transportation, but a sacred symbol of the community. The construction of the vessel was funded by the entire village, and every resident contributed what they could. Some provided wood, some forged rivets, and others wove meters of woolen sailcloth. The ship represented the farmers' collective investment in a brighter and more prosperous future. Therefore, the loss of a ship in a storm became a true economic catastrophe for the entire home fjord. Incredibly, the Vikings used animal fat and tar to waterproof their precious ships. They constantly coated the planks with foul-smelling mixtures to protect the wood from voracious shipworms. The smell on board was so intense that an unaccustomed person would easily lose consciousness within the first few minutes. The crews slept huddled together on the open decks under pouring, icy rain, sheltering under a single canvas sheet. To a modern person, such cruising conditions would seem like the most egregious violation of human rights. For Scandinavian farmers, it was simply a tedious business trip in search of new resources. Ultimately, it was the trade routes established by these ships that reshaped the map of Europe at the time. The Scandinavians founded many cities that are known today as Dublin, Kiev, and Novgorod. They sought not bloodshed and destruction, but profitable markets for their goods. Their axes were merely a safeguard to protect their honestly earned medieval capital. Engineering triumphed over brute force, and trade proved more important than empty military victories. The word Viking, as mentioned earlier, did not denote a specific nationality or profession. To go Viking simply meant packing one's belongings and setting off on a summer trip abroad. For most Scandinavians, this was seasonal work between spring planting and the fall harvest. They were not fanatical warriors who had dedicated their lives exclusively to the art of war. They were ordinary men who urgently needed silver to pay off mounting debts. Imagine a modern office clerk who takes a vacation to work as a construction worker for some extra cash. That's roughly how a Scandinavian farmer thought as he sharpened his spear before a summer expedition. As soon as the snow melted from the fields and the seeds were sown, there was a lull. The ears of grain needed time to grow, and life in the village became downright boring. Instead of sitting idly by, young men would set out on risky commercial expeditions. They hoped to return with a profit before the wheat ripened for the inevitable autumn harvest. Most of the famous raids on British monasteries were driven by ironclad economic logic. Monasteries were medieval banks where vast riches were stored, completely unguarded. To the Scandinavians, it was absurd to see mountains of gold guarded only by unarmed, praying old men. In their harsh world, if you couldn't protect your property, then you didn't need it. It was a brutal but pragmatic business venture, devoid of any religious hatred toward Christians. European chronicles describe these attacks as sudden raids by demons from the very depths of hell. However, the chroniclers were, as a rule, the very monks who had been robbed, and they greatly exaggerated the scale of the disaster. In reality, the average raiding party rarely exceeded the crews of 3 or 4 merchant ships. This was not a massive professional army, but rather a well-organized gang of daring robbers. They struck quickly, took valuables, and vanished over the horizon before regular troops arrived. Today, such actions would be called the guerrilla tactics of small, highly mobile sabotage groups. Once they reached new, rich lands, the Scandinavians often preferred trade to open armed conflict. If a local ruler fielded a strong army, the Norse would calmly take out their scales for silver. They gladly sold furs and walrus ivory in exchange for Frankish wine or grain. They didn't care at all how they made a profit, through honest trade or plunder. The main goal was to bring resources home so that their families wouldn't starve to death in the winter. It was precisely this pragmatism that made them the best mercenaries for many foreign rulers. The Byzantine emperors formed the famous Varangian Guard from the Scandinavians, an elite unit of personal bodyguards. They paid the farmers in gold, and the farmers faithfully carried out their bloody corporate duties. For a northern man, serving in Constantinople was akin to winning a modern-day lottery. Upon returning home, he could buy the best land and become the most respected man in the region. The myth of bloodthirsty berserkers who felt no pain is also greatly exaggerated by popular culture. Yes, the sagas mention mad warriors who bit their shields and fought without heavy armor, but scholars believe this was a psychological ploy to intimidate an inexperienced opponent. Furthermore, their strange behavior is often attributed to the consumption of psychedelic mushrooms or herbal concoctions before battle. In a real large-scale battle, an uncontrollable madman was a danger to his own organized ranks. Armies need strict discipline, not a mob of screaming, drug-crazed warriors wielding massive axes. Over time, this seasonal business began to evolve into full-scale colonization of new territories. Tired of Norway's icy winds, the farmers realized that the soil in England was soft and fertile. They began bringing their families, building farms, and peacefully assimilating with the local population. The invaders quickly turned into ordinary British taxpayers who respected the law and worked the land. Genetics proves that millions of modern Britons carry the blood of these rugged settlers. Danlow, a region in England where Scandinavian laws were in effect, was teeming with peaceful merchants and artisans. Former raiders opened smithies, baked bread, and produced high-quality leather goods for the local market. York, founded by the Vikings, became one of the largest and wealthiest commercial centers in all of medieval Europe. It turned out that building an economy was far more profitable than constantly risking one's life in bloody skirmishes. Yesterday's pirates turned out to be brilliant businessmen and talented city planners with an excellent nose for profit. This shatters the image of savages who leave behind only smoldering ruins and mountains of corpses. After all, the Viking Age did not end because of some grand military defeats. The Scandinavians simply integrated into the European economy, adopted Christianity, and became like everyone else. Their kings began minting their own coins and building dull, bureaucratic states. Farmers no longer needed to raid monasteries because trade had become safe and profitable. The great warriors simply returned to their plows, leaving their descendants only colorful, bloody sagas. When a massive Scandinavian fleet set out on a raid, they faced a colossal logistical challenge. Providing food and fresh water for thousands of people on the open sea was an incredibly difficult undertaking. Modern generals use entire transport units and complex computer supply algorithms for this. The Vikings managed with dried cod, sour milk, and strict peasant discipline. They calculated rations with the precision of professional dietitians to avoid scurvy and hunger riots. The backbone of their society was a unique legal system known as the Ting, a popular assembly of free men. It was the prototype of a modern parliament where farmers resolved disputes without resorting to brute force. If a person committed a crime, their fate was decided not by a dictatorial king, but by a court of neighbors equal to them. A murderer could be sentenced to pay a huge fine to the victim's relatives or be banished from the community forever. For bloodthirsty savages, they relied too often on lawyers and complex legal precedents. In essence, the law was respected far more than the sharpest sword or the heaviest battle axe. Exile was considered the most terrible punishment, far worse than a quick and honorable death in battle. A man declared an outlaw lost all protection from the community and became a completely defenseless target. Any passerby had the right to kill the outcast without fear of blood revenge or legal prosecution. It was precisely these outcast criminals who often became the pioneers of new lands, driven by desperation and despair. Eric the Red discovered Greenland not out of a spirit of adventure, but because he was fleeing harsh justice. The Scandinavians' attitude toward personal hygiene deserves special attention, as it debunks yet another popular myth. While enlightened Europe wallowed in filth, the Vikings regularly bathed in hot springs. Archaeologists have found thousands of intricately carved bone combs, tweezers, and ear spoons in their settlements. English chronicles noted with indignation that the Northerners bathed and changed their clothes too often. They did this deliberately to lure noble British women with their appealing cleanliness. It sounds funny, but personal hygiene was a real weapon of psychological influence against their unwashed neighbors. Blacksmithing and jewelry making revealed the true level of aesthetic development among these rugged seafarers. Artisans created incredibly intricate silver brooches, bracelets, and pendants with the finest interlacing of animal motifs. These ornaments served not merely as trinkets, but as a wearable bank account in case of an unforeseen crisis. If a farmer urgently needed to buy a cow, he would simply cut off a piece of his bracelet. This system of cut silver worked more effectively than many modern, cumbersome financial instruments. It is interesting to examine their medical knowledge gained through experience on farms and battlefields. They knew how to apply splints to broken bones, use antiseptic mosses, and even perform complex amputations. Scandinavian healers would brew a special onion soup to test the severity of deep abdominal wounds. If the healer smelled onions coming from the wound, he knew the intestines were perforated and the person was doomed. A brutal but utterly logical diagnostic method requiring no X-rays or years of university training. Even their religion was incredibly practical and reflected the harsh realities of peasant life in the north. Thor, the most popular god among the people, was not just a warrior with a hammer from comic books. He was the patron of simple farmers, protecting their fields from ice giants and vicious storms. Farmers prayed to him not for victory in battle, but for good rain and a bountiful harvest. Odin, the god of war and wisdom, was the patron of the aristocracy, while ordinary people trusted Thor more. This shows that agricultural concerns always remained their top and most important priority. Children in Scandinavian families did not have a carefree childhood filled with toys and long school hours. From a young age, they began working on the farm, learning invaluable survival skills from their parents. Boys were taught to handle tools, while girls mastered the complex art of spinning and weaving. By the age of 14, a teenager was considered a fully fledged adult, ready to start a family of their own. Your modern office job requires a degree, but back then, young people were already running entire agricultural enterprises. Slavery was also an integral part of this economically efficient but harsh and cynical system. Captives, known as thralls, performed the dirtiest and most grueling work in the fields. But even a slave had the theoretical opportunity to save up silver and officially buy his freedom. Once freed, he could receive a plot of land and begin life as an ordinary, full-fledged Scandinavian farmer. This social mobility seems remarkable for an era where one's origins typically determined one's entire fate. The pragmatic Norse valued hard work far more than noble lineage or blue blood. Thus, the entire society was built around a single main goal: survival in extreme conditions. Military campaigns were merely a minor side effect of their incredible energy and thirst for a better life. They were ruthless, pragmatic businessmen who used axes instead of contracts and ships instead of trucks. Their legacy is not blood on the snow, but powerful trade networks that united all of Europe. It's time to consign the myth of the mindless berserkers to the archives, making way for the true geniuses of survival. History often simplifies complex phenomena to make them more palatable to the general public. It is much easier to believe in the myth of invincible giants born solely for war and destruction. But reality, as we see, conceals a far more interesting and profound picture. These people were brilliant engineers, hardy farmers, and pragmatic traders trying to survive at any cost. Their true strength lay not in the sharpness of their iron, but in their incredible ability to adapt. When we remove their horned helmets and strip away the cinematic hype, true greatness emerges. The Viking Age was built on calloused hands, patience at the loom, and the cold calculation of survival. They did not consider themselves warriors, because war was merely one of many tools of daily life. Today's business people can learn from these ancient farmers about logistics, economics, and the art of taking risks. It sounds unbelievable, but the most notorious villains of the early Middle Ages turned out to be its leading economic innovators. It's time to admit that the Viking axe was made to build, not to destroy.